Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. If you up late at night, studying for the real estate exam, good luck. Hopefully you stand up. Hopefully you're retaining this information. But this section is on property ownership, and today we're going to do a short video on joint tenancy and the right to survivorship. So let me cut the music. Thank you for joining me in this session. So, what is joint tenancy, right? All right. So it's a form of ownership. Um, you have four types of ownership that we are going to study for this test. And the four types of ownership, there's two really, really important ones, and then two that's not that much, not that really that much important in terms of uh, needing to learn them for the test. Which we gonna cover them either way it goes. But the four types of ownership is going to be joint tenancy with the right to survivorship, tenancy in common. You got the ownership and tenancy and severalty, meaning that one person owns the property. And tenancy by the entirety typically is going to be like a married couple. Typically is going to take that type of ownership. Now, some states recognize tenancy by the entirety, some states don't. Like in Ohio, we're a dower state, so we recognize dower versus Tennessee by the entirety. But for the test, I don't, I never tell people not to study certain things on the test. That's left up to you and your independent research and studying for the test. But what you do want to do is you want to make sure, my bad. What you do want to do is you want to make sure that you know joint tenancy with the rights of survivorship and the key elements that differentiate that from the other forms of ownership like tenancy in common. So in short, before going to take the test, you want to make sure that you know tenancy in common and joint tenancy out of the property ownership section of the test. Now, property ownership is a fairly large section of the test. In this section, you're going to see 7 to 8 questions that they're going to give you on this test. So that's a big percentage, 8 to 10% of the test. So on for this section, you got to be able to get about 6 of them right, flat out. Now, if you could get all of them right, that's good. But for this test, you need to get about 6 or 7 of those questions right. And if you can, that's great. That's going to be a great start to the test. Um, what I'm doing in this video today is I'm going to show you different ways they're going to ask you questions about joint tenancy, and we'll have a brief discussion about some of those questions and just the different ways they mix them up. What are they trying to get you to understand about the question? What do you need to understand about joint tenancy? So joint tenancy is definitely a section that you're going to need that you're more than likely going to get a question about joint tenancy and tenancy in the common and how they differentiate from each other. So let's go over what joint tenancy is, and I'll give you an example. Say, for instance, I'm about to get married, me and my wife, we want to obtain a property, and we both have kids. She has kids, I have kids, and we don't want to have to worry about if one of us move on or pass, um, having the other person figure out where they're going to live or what's going to happen, and maybe perhaps you have to go through probate or all of this, just different types of litigation and different types of processes and ways that of things that happen when someone moves on. So we decided to just take the property, the new property that we got. We met, we got married, just got married. And so we want to go ahead and buy a property. We want to take it to the point where she don't want to have to worry about if she moves on and me having and she don't want to have to worry about me having somewhere to live and vice versa. If I move on, we don't want to have to worry about a place for her to live. So joint tenancy with the right to survivorship is the type of ownership structure that we would take. And so with that being said, we are going to focus on some of the questions that are that you're going to probably see with this type of ownership. So let's take a look at some of the questions that you may run into when you're taking your test in the different ways that they're going to ask them. Now, these are 6 questions that I pulled out. I have a bunch of questions that I go over with students and stuff like that. But here is some of the questions and the ways that they ask them about joint tenancy. So let me share my screen and let's go over the first one here. Now, first, let me also talk about the key components of joint tenancy. So in joint tenancy, you have to start off with, they're called the four unities of time, right? So one of the key unities of time, or unities, are the four unities, not the unities of time, but just the four unities of joint tenancy. So the one of the most important unities of joint tenancy is that we have to have equal shares. So right off the bat, when you're talking about joint tenancy, it has to be equal, 50-50, 33.3, 33.3. So how many ever people or tenants that are in the actual joint tenancy, it has to be equal, right? That's a key component of joint tenancy, but that's not unique because you can have equal shares in the other forms of ownership, right? You can have equal shares in tenancy in common. The unique feature about joint tenancy is that you have the right to survive, the right of survivalship, and that it passes on to the other tenants that remains in the joint tenancy. So if someone was to die, then that person's interest automatically goes back to the other person. So that's the unique portion of joint tenancy. Some people will say, well, equal shares, equal shares. Well, that's not unique to joint tenancy. You're correct. You have to have equal shares, but that's not unique to joint tenancy. What's unique to joint tenancy is that it automatically passes on to the other tenants in the joint tenancy. And there's no need for probate. There's no need for litigation. That person's interest that was in that joint tenant structure, automatically their interest passes on to the other one. So how have we seen some of the ways that they ask the questions on the test? Now, property ownership, I must say this as well. Property ownership is a big definitions or vocabulary section. It's not many things that could trip you up in here. These questions are very objective. You have to think a little bit in regards to a little bit of subjectivity with some of the questions, but for the most part, if you know the definitions, you're going to do well on property ownership. So that's the key to this section of the exam is know the definitions. There's a lot of different definitions. Some of them are more technical than others, but definitely when you're studying for the test, in terms of ownership, know joint tenancy and tenancy in common. So here's a question in a way that they would ask you about joint tenancy. So the first one says, which feature is unique to joint tenancy compared to the other forms of property co-ownership? So the unique feature, like I said, some people would say equal shares. Well, again, other forms of ownership has the ability to have equal shares. That's not unique to joint tenancy. What's unique to joint tenancy is the fact that you have the right to of survivorship, and that interest automatically passes to the other individual or individuals in the joint tenancy structure. So that's the unique component. So if you get a question about here, again, what feature is unique, that unique word is very important because in the questions and the answers, they'll probably have equal interest. And then another question, another answer will be um, the right of survivorship. And the right of survivorship is the unique feature of joint tenancy. So they may ask you that question. And with that, that's not really a definition question. You just got to kind of know based on your studies and whatever questions and whatever classes and books you've read that the unique feature of joint tenancy is the right of survivorship. The next question, which action can a joint tenant take to sever the joint tenancy converted into a tenancy in common? Let's talk about that a little bit. So if one of the tenants in a joint tenancy wants to get out of the joint tenancy and say for instance they want to sell their interest to someone else, then when they do that, that ownership structure converts from a joint tenancy to a tenancy in common. All right. And so this question is a more technical question. Very unlikely that they would probably ask you something like this technical on the test, but we can answer this question. What action can a joint tenant take to sever the joint tenancy, converting it into a tenancy in common? Well, sometimes this happens when you have a married couple that wants to get a divorce. So there's a number of different ways that you can do this. You can go to a court and have like the court do a partition or forced sale. So what this is really trying to ask you, and the key thing about this question is, what happens to a joint tenancy if one of the tenants wants to get rid of get rid of their interest in that joint tenancy structure? Well, the joint tenancy converts into a tenancy in common structure. So that's the key thing to take away from that question. All right, what's the next one? What is a defining characteristic of joint tenancy? Well, the defining characteristics, there may be two, but there's a couple of them, but the two main ones is equal shares. You have to have equal shares, and you have to take possession to the title at the same time through the same deed. All right. You also have the right of survivorship, right? There's no probate. There's no need for litigation. If one of the tenants moves on, their interest automatically transfers to the other tenant. That's the unique portion of that. So they may ask you, what is the defining characteristic of joint tenancy? Up here, they ask you, what is the unique feature of joint tenancy? All right. But if you answer enough questions and you do enough of deep research about joint tenancy, those two things or those things will stick in your head. Here's another question. A couple is purchasing a vacation home and wishes for the property to automatically pass to the surviving partner upon death. Which form of ownership should they choose? That's more of likely of a question that you'll get on the test, and they'll have tenancy in common. They'll have LLC, limited time. They'll have different types of stuff that's to confuse you. But they definitely should choose joint tenancy with the right of survivorship, because this right here is a direct example of what a joint tenancy structure would command. Like if two people want to get together and they want to make sure that if something happens to one of them and they were to move on, that the other one's going to be able to enjoy the property that they purchased together, then you definitely want to be in a joint tenancy with a right to survivorship. All right. The next question, that question right there is definitely something that you may see on the test. The next question, which form of property ownership includes the right to survivorship? As soon as I hear right to survivorship, my head goes straight to joint tenancy, right? Because tenancy in common, they don't enjoy the right of survivorship. Neither do the other structures of property ownership. So, which form of property ownership includes the right to survivorship, automatically transferring ownership of the surviving owner upon one's death? There's the definition of tenancy. I'm a joint tenancy with the right to survivorship, right? That they may ask you like that. That may be another way that they're going to ask you the question, and the answers will be tenancy in common, tenancy by the entireties, joint tenancy with the right to survivorship. But these last two questions are more like the questions that you probably will see on the test than these other questions. All right, so this is the definite definition of tenancy in common. I'm joint tenancy. I strike that, joint tenancy. And then the last question that we're going to go over, a married couple is purchasing a home and considering how to take title. They want to ensure that if one of them passes away, the other will automatically inherit the interest without going through probate. Which form of ownership should they choose? That may be a very good question that they're going to ask you on a test. If we know the definition and a different tenets of a joint tenancy, we should be able to answer that question no problem. And we have to be able to get these types of questions right, because these questions are fairly simple if you went over the vocabulary, went over the definitions, and studied note cards and different things like that. So that's definitely joint tenancy. That's the form of ownership that they definitely want to have if they want to ensure that if one of them passes away, the other one will automatically inherit the other's interest without having to go through probate, without having to do any type of litigation. So in this class, I try to just take it from layman, try to take it from all these technical terms and put it in a more layman's term. Period. If you are trying to get in a situation with someone, it may be a brother, it may be a friend, it may be family members or whatever, and you want to make sure that there's that your interest or their interest automatically passes to one or the other, without any type of probate litigation or anything like that, you definitely want to go with joint tenancy. We see a lot of married couples do joint tenancy because they don't want to have to worry about the other person, and they're having to negotiate with kids or having to do litigation and spend money to figure out what's going to happen with the estate. They do a joint tenancy, so all of that stuff is figured out before, as soon as one of the tenants move on or passes away. So this will conclude this video. Thank you for joining me. This is Pass the Test. This is Agent Success Training, and my name is Hans Smith.